In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 1 from our textbook, which is We the People. We're going to see in this chapter, we're going to see first the organization of the textbook. Most chapters are going to follow this type of format. But also in this chapter, excuse me, we're going to see some ideas that are introduced, which we'll discuss more in depth in later chapters. Now, this lecture is not covering every single aspect of the chapter. We just don't have time to go over all of that. So please make sure you are still reading the materials of the chapter because you are responsible for all parts of the chapter reading. But for here, we're going to look at Chapter 1, which is Americans and their political values. And so the chapter starts out interesting. It starts out with a little story talking about, what is government and why does it matter? And it starts with the story of looking at college students who were working during the COVID epidemic and then lost their jobs and applied for benefits that were there for other workers. Yet, when they were denied these or had to refund them because they were college students, they actually fought to change the law. Why? Because in the past, often college students who were working or high school students who were working, both, were often working for more, spend money, not money that a household was depending on. Yet the students in this story, it talked about how they fought because they were working to support the household, and therefore they believed they should be entitled for the same benefits. And so using their voices, they were able to go and make a change and did get those laws changed, so they did get the benefits. And the reason they start out with this story is to tell you, right? Many times, especially younger generations, feel removed from the government and think that the government really doesn't affect them or that they have a chance of changing the government. And what the story is showing is that you do have voice and you do have power, and you should use it to help change things that you don't like. Now, page 6 of our textbook also shows an interesting example of how much the presence of government is, and as they call it, quote, the daily life of a student at a state university. Often things that the government controls, we don't even think about. We just assume that these things are going to be here and we take them for granted. For example, when you get up and, take your shower or brush your teeth in the morning, you assume water is going to be there and that it's going to be clean, healthy, safe water. Those are all things that are controlled by the government. So it is definitely interesting. Look at that example on page 6 just for, how many things in just our daily routines the government is actually involved in. Okay, so first, makes sense, we're going to start with looking at this idea of what is government. And so you see also in the textbook, the definition of government is institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. Very broad, right? Pretty simple. Institutions and procedures, well, what are those, right? We can talk about those in more detail later. And which a territory, literally meaning a geographical area, and its people are ruled. We'll talk a little bit later. What is this idea of the people? Who are the people that are included here? In these forms of government, sometimes this can be very, very simple, and other times it can be very, very complex. The hardest part of a government is establishing one that can last over time. And then even more difficult than that is establishing a stable government that lasts, and that is true to the core values of the people it's supposed to govern and represent. In America, we say these values are liberty, equality, and justice. However, these all mean different things, and we'll discuss them a little bit later in the chapter, and they often mean different things to different people. And then that's where we get the term politics. What are politics? This refers to the conflicts and struggles over leadership, structure, and policies of a government. So when we look at a government, we have different forms of government. And when we're trying to decide what form of government we are examining, two questions help determine the differences. First, we ask who governs, and then second, we ask how do they govern. So let's start with first who governs. So first we have what's called an autocracy. This is where we have a single individual. Think Auto 1, right? Autocracy, and this is a single individual who rules. This could be a king, a queen, a dictator. Second, we have what's called an oligarchy. This is where a small group of individuals control most of the government decisions. So autocracy, 1. Oligarchy, it's a small group of individuals. Examples of oligarchy can be a group of landowners, maybe military officers, maybe a group of wealthy merchants. And then we have what's called a democracy. In a democracy, the citizens or the general adult population have the power to rule themselves. And what we mean by this power to rule themselves, this is when the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. And this is what we call popular sovereignty. We call that popular sovereignty. All right, then as we move on, we're going to look at how do they govern. And so we're going to start first with what's called a constitutional government. In this, we have formal and effective limits that are placed on the powers of the government. So the United States is an example of this. We have the powers of the government are outlined by our Constitution. In our Constitution, it very clearly states our 3 branches of government, what they do, how they are made up, and what their jobs are. And it also defines the limits of their jobs or their roles. If they overreach these, that is seen as unconstitutional and therefore against our rule of government. Next, we have authoritarian. In this, the government recognizes no formal limits, so we don't have anything like a constitution. However, they still may be restricted by the power of other social institutions. So again, no formal constitution or something in place. However, other things such as maybe there are self-governing territories, organized religions, business organizations, or other labor unions have such power that they're actually able to restrict some of the rule of the government. Then we have totalitarian, and think of that as total. The government has total control. In a totalitarian government that recognizes no formal limits to its power, and even more than that, it seeks to absorb or eliminate other social institutions that may challenge it. So, example, there would be absolutely no constitution, and unlike in authoritarian governments where we have those outside groups that have power, a totalitarian government would seek to destroy those, to get rid of them, so there are no limits on the power of the government. Examples of that would be the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, Nazi Germany, and then even today, North Korea. Today, over 68% of the global populations lives in electoral and closed autocracies. 14% enjoy true liberal democracy with free and fair elections, and 19% live in more limited democracies. And the debate over limiting government and who has the power or right to do so has always been an issue throughout forms of government. All right, so let's look at the United States. So democracy in the United States. When asked what form of government we have, most people would say we are a democracy, but that's not the full truth. We have what's called a direct democracy. This is a system that permits citizens to vote directly on laws and policies. That's not what we have. That would be a direct democracy. That means every single act, every law, everything that government was passing, we would have to vote on that. And that is not what we have. What we have here is more of a representational democracy. What does that mean? That means we elect people who then, basically, we give them the authority to then go in and vote and pass directly on the laws and policies. Part of the reason why we don't have a direct democracy was there was the fear this would lead to majority rule. What does that mean? Say you have a majority of the population who believes in certain things. So they would vote for it, and then what would happen to the minorities? The minorities would be stuck following the majority rule. And that was a fear, that the majority would determine what the government does, and minorities would basically be at the whims of the majority and would never be able to change that. So with this, right, what we have has concerns more for the rights of minorities. Meaning, even though the government follows the preferences of the majority, they also still protect the rights and interests of the minority. That just because you're in the minority doesn't mean you don't have rights. And this is what's called majority rule, minority rights. And again, the United States today is a representative democracy or a republic. Here, citizens have the opportunity to elect their top officials and representatives, and then those representatives play the significant role in government decision-making policy. So an easiest example is we elect a president, right? We elect the head of the executive branch, and then the president is the one who then goes in, supposed to be representing the people who elected them, and they go in and make those decisions. And that's going to lead us to our next topic, which is participation in government. Again, we already mentioned politics, but just to refresh, politics refers to conflicts over who the government's leadership is, how the government is organized, and what its policies are. So within this, we have what's called political power, and that means you feel in having a say in these in issues, that you have some sort of influence over a government's leadership, organization, and policies. And again, let's stick with my previous example of this, right? We elect a president into office. Well, what happens if we don't like what the president is doing? What can we, as a everyday normal citizen, do? Well, we do have power. Number one, if they're up for re-election, we cannot re-elect them. We can also fight for others, right? If we have a president who is abusing their powers, what can we do? We can go to our senators and our House of Representatives and say, hey, you need to put the president in check. Why? They have the power to impeach the president. So we can go and put pressure on our other elected officials to help rein in, right, the forms of government. So this is our type of political power, right? People think, oh, well, after I, voted, there's nothing more I can do. There is a lot that you can do, and that is your political power. Also, we have the theory of pluralism. Pluralism is a theory that all interests are and should be free to compete for influence in government. Again, meaning even if you're a normal everyday citizen, right? You don't have to be a giant organization. You don't have to be a giant business. You don't have to be a millionaire. Under pluralism, that all are and should be free to compete for influence in government. With this, the outcome of competition is often compromise and moderation, meaning, right, that we have to compromise on things. It's not just one party in control over the other, that we often come to some common ground where we get part of what we want, but then we also agree with part of what the other sides want, so we get to a compromise and it can have a more effective government. And then this also leads to the idea of citizenship. Citizenship itself is based on participation, knowledge, and efficacy. The definition of a citizen is membership in a political community that provides legal rights and carries participation responsibilities. This is often what we call our civic duty, that as citizens, we have responsibilities. This includes upholding the Constitution, obeying federal, state, and local laws, paying taxes, serving on juries when required, and being informed about political issues. As the political theorist John Locke would say, this also would include that we have a duty to revolt if a government is not upholding their end of the deal. So for an example, in the American Revolution, why did the colonies revolt against Britain? Because they said they weren't upholding their end, that they had no representation and they really weren't part of the government. Therefore, under the theories of Locke, as a citizen, you have the duty to then throw off that government, right? It's not just your right to do this, it's your duty to do this. Then we go to political knowledge. This is a big one. Democracies function best when citizens have the knowledge needed to engage in political debate. You gotta do your research. You gotta really study the issues. Also, we should have the knowledge of the rules and processes that govern political institutions and the principles they rest on. We need to know these. That way, if you're trying to change something, it doesn't get thrown out for a technical issue. Also, we need to know these in a way that relate to our own interests. Sadly enough, actual political knowledge in the United States remains very spotty. For example, in a 2021 survey, 56% of those surveyed could identify all three branches of the federal government, and only 35% knew the term of office for a senator was 6 years. Also, as we're seeing, people are depending on unreliable sources. Again, we're not putting the work in there. We're just believing whatever we're told. Social media has had a big influence on that we read something, online and we believe it as factual. We have a duty and obligation to go research these things. If there's an article out there, go out and research, fact check it. Look at who is writing this article. I know my mother is very famous for me. She'll tell me like, oh my gosh, did you hear this? And I'll be like, Mom, that's absolutely not true. Where did you find that? And she's like, well, on Facebook. And that's what's the problem, is people are looking at unreliable sources of information. Also, we have what's called disinformation. And I ask you to discuss this in this week's discussion. What is disinformation? Disinformation is false information that is shared intentionally to reach a political goal. So think about that. They put out this information knowing it is false, and they share it intentionally to reach their own political goal. You can see this complicates the process of acquiring valid political information. Often this information is put out in a way that makes it seem reliable and that it is true and factual, but in fact it's not. It's incorrect, it's false information. We see this very prevalent today, unfortunately, on both sides of our system. What we see is one side putting out information and the other side calling it fake news, even when the information has been proven to be true. But if we go out there and say, well, this is not true, it's false, because this side is lying to you, that is disinformation. They know that this information is true, yet they're calling it false for their own political ends. And so again, it goes to us. We as the citizen, it's our responsibility to go out and do the work. Should our political leaders be putting out disinformation? Absolutely not. But the reality is they are. So we've got to find that information. Then what we have finally is political efficacy. This is the belief that one can influence government and politics, meaning you're going to be effective. What you do is effective. If people believe they can't make a difference, they often won't participate in government at all. So think about that, right? It's kind of the same idea. Why didn't you get up Saturday and go run a marathon? Well, if you haven't been training, you're probably like, well, I can't do that. So you don't even bother. Same thing here. If people believe that they cannot make a difference in their government, they often don't participate at all. Also, Americans' sense of political efficacy has declined over time. In 1960, only 25% felt shut out from the government. However, in 2019, 71% surveyed stated that elected officials don't care what ordinary people think, and 52% disagreed with the idea that the government is really run for the benefit of the people. And if you think about that, that's very sad, right? Literally, we state we the people, that's who this government is supposed to represent. But over half of the population believes the government is not really there for the benefit of the people. So then that brings us to our next topic of who are the people, right? Who are Americans? We state we the people, but who is this? Largely, again, we are a land of immigrants. However, right, indigenous individuals were largely ignored as the United States came to be and expanded. With our original document saying we the people, did the founding fathers really mean to include everybody in this? Absolutely not. It was actually a very limited amount that they actually meant we the people. In 1790, this was the year of the first official census report, the United States population was 3.9 million. In 2022, the population is over 333 million. As time has gone on, the population has also become more diverse in many different dimensions. In 1790, the 13 original states, which were along the eastern coast, in 1790, 81% of Americans traced their roots to Europe, mostly British and Northern Europe, meaning they were white. 20% of the population were of African origin. However, most were slaves. At that time, only 1.5% of the black population was free. Also, at this time, we have an unknown number of Native individuals because they were not even counted as part of the census. Why? Because the government did not consider them Americans. Then we move to 1900. By this point, the country reaches across the continent. Immigration boosted population to over 76 million. However, most people predominantly were those of European ancestors. We are now starting to see some more from Southern and Eastern Europe. At this time, the black population is 12%, the Latin American population is less than 1%, and the Asian population is less than 1%. At this time, in 1910, 14.7% of the total United States population was foreign born, meaning they were not born in the United States. And so what we start to see here with increasing in some of the numbers of those who are not from Northwestern European descent, we start to see an increased fear in those who are of Northwestern European descent. We start to see this fear of them losing their long dominating position of power in America's society and politics. We see this clearly after World War II, 1945. We have new immigration laws passed that sharply limit how many people could enter into the United States each year. We also had the Immigration Act of 1924, which used national origins quota system, meaning strict numbers, meaning specific countries, only so many people from those countries could immigrate into the United States each year. What this did, it wasn't equal. It wasn't like every country got 50 people. They were based off of other ideas. So this new system set up a hierarchy of admissions. Northern and Western European countries receive very generous quotas, right, for new immigrants, meaning those who were from Northern and Western Europe, they could continue to immigrate to the United States. However, Eastern and Southern European countries were granted very small quotas, and almost all immigrants from Asia and African countries were completely banned. And so again, we see with this is keeping that establishment, the dominant power, in the hands of those who are Northern and Western European descent. By the 1970s, these guidelines had reduced foreign-born population in the United States to an all-time low of 5%. So only 5% of the overall population had been born outside of the United States. And again, this really wasn't a new idea. We see this throughout the history of the United States. Most people of African descent were not deemed citizens until 1868, with the passage of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Native Americans weren't officially recognized until 1924. However, they still did not have the right to vote. With the Naturalization Act of 1790, this was a law that stated that only free white people could even become citizens of the United States, and this was not limited until 1870. We also have other issues discussing white and what whiteness means. What we see is a lot of other groups were put under the umbrella of white. However, they were often not given the same rights and privileges of those who are white. Example of this would be Hispanic Americans. Hispanic Americans were often classified as white, but not given the same rights. And so we can look through the history of the United States, and we'll look at more of that in depth throughout the class. So who are Americans in the 21st century? Well, basically, that's a really good question. The text itself breaks it down and looks at several different categories, such as race and ethnicity, religion, age, geography, socioeconomic status, and population and politics. So we'll go through all of these individually. So we're going to start with race and ethnicity. In the 2020 census, the population, Latinos were 18.7%, Asians 6%, and I also want you to think how broad those categories are. Black or African American were 12.4%, and non-Hispanic whites were 61.6%. Also, more than 33 million Americans, meaning 1 in 10, identified as being of 2 or more races, and this was a category that was not added to the census until 2000. In 2019, more than half of Americans under 16 identified as a member of a racial or minority group. And then with continuing diversity, the United States is projected to become a majority-minority country by 2050, meaning that there won't be one dominant class. Right now, it's still the non-Hispanic white. However, we'll see if these projections will come out to be true. Why? What we're seeing now is our current administration is working very hard to limit this. There are estimates that there are over 12 million immigrants in the United States that are here without legal authorization. But we also have to keep in mind, undocumented immigrants remain ineligible for most public benefits. There were some exceptions that were passed, and this includes education and also emergency medical care. All right, moving to religion. Again, there is no official religion of the United States. Many think of the United States as a Judeo-Christian nation, and it was, right? 50 years ago, 95% of the population identified either as Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. But by 2021, this had fallen to 96% of the total population. In 2021, if we want to break it down further, 35% of the population identified as Protestant, 22% as Catholic, 10% as Christian non-specific, 2% as Jewish, 1% as Mormon, and nearly 1% identified as Muslims. However, this number was actually included in the 6% who identified themselves as other. So we see this widening disparity in the different religions in the United States. Also, age is something we have to look at. As life expectancy increased, meaning people lived longer, so did the number of Americans over 65. In 2020, 16% of the population was over 65 years of age. However, also in 2020, the percentage of children declined from 44% of the population in 1900 to 22.4% of the population. Also, what's interesting is most of those who identified as older Americans identified as white. And so that also leads to some other implications when we look at things such as healthcare and income disparity of whose lives are actually longer. All right, next we'll look at geography. For most of the history of the United States, people have moved away from the rural or country settings and have moved to large cities and suburbs. Why? Think about it. Before 1920, less than half the population lived in urban areas or suburbs. Why? What did most people do for a living? As most people were farmers. That has changed. In fact, today, right, so in 1920, less than half of the population lived in urban areas and suburbs, meaning cities and suburbs. Now, over 80% of the total population lives in urban areas and suburbs. All right, next we're going to move to socioeconomic status. For much of U.S. history, most Americans were relatively poor working people. Again, most people were farmers. In the late 1800s, we have what's called the Gilded Age. However, it was only gilded for very few. Why in the Gilded Age? What happens is what we see emerging is an extremely wealthy elite group of individuals. By 1828, 25% of the annual national income went to the top 1% of earners. So think about that. Of the entire population, 1% had 25% of the annual national income. Within that, the top 10% took home 46% of the total income. So that left the other 90% of the population to share 54% of the total income. What we do see, though, is we do see a growth of the middle class, especially the white middle class, after the New Deal programs of the 1930s and 40s that helped to counteract the Great Depression. And we had the post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 60s. Also in the 1960s, with enactment of civil rights legislation and social programs, this helped shrink the income disparity. However, since then, we've gone back the other way. Economic disparity has again widened in what some call the second Gilded Age. Again, it's only gilded for very few. By 2021, the top 1% of the population earned 27% of total household wealth. At the same time, the middle 60% of households saw their income drop to 26.6%. So in other words, the top 1% holds more wealth than the entire American middle class. Also at the same time, we saw an increase of people who live below the poverty level. This rose to 11.4% of the population. And so when we're talking about wealth, what we're talking about is the difference between a household's assets, meaning what you own that contains economic value, house, cars, stock, and such. And we compare that, we're looking at it, comparing it to your debt. And what we see is there is a radical gap in wealth. Especially we're also seeing what's called a racial wealth gap. This refers to the disparity in assets of the typical American households across ethnic and racial groups. So example, according to recent data, the median, meaning the median number of a white household has over 188,200 in wealth. So 188,000 just over is the median number for a white household. The median for a Latino household is just over $36,000, and the median for a Black or African American household is just a little over $24,000. So when you look at that, we see a great disparity between the races. All right, and then that's going to bring us to the last factor the textbook examines, which is population and politics. And with this, as we're going to see, as population growth and shifts occur, this causes debates about how to appropriate these populations in the government. These conflicts have significant implications for the balance of representation among different regions of the country and between rural and rural areas. So we have to think, as our population shifts, does our government need to shift to adequately represent the people in the specific areas? All right, now we're going to move to our next topic, where we're going to look at ideas of liberty, equality, and justice. We mentioned them a little bit earlier, and we talked about how these are often seen as American political values. Our foundational documents of the country, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, declared a set of principles, the purpose of the new republic. What were these principles? Liberty, equality, and justice. Most citizens today still affirm these values, which form our political culture. When we talk about political culture, what does that mean? That means broadly shared values, beliefs, and attitudes about how the government should function. However, how these are defined and should be applied often differ. So first we'll talk about the idea of liberty. Liberty is most often associated with the idea of freedom. So when we're talking it in the sense of government, what does it mean? Usually it's understood as freedom from government control, including personal freedom and economic freedom. These are closely associated with the ideas of a limited government. And again, that limited government, principle of constitutional government, whose powers are defined and limited by a constitution. Why can't the government tell you have to be in bed at 9 o'clock? Well, because we have a constitution that protects our individual freedoms of this. With our constitution is the shortest written and also the longest surviving constitution of any government in the world. The genius of our Constitution is that it is definitive, meaning it is clear in some aspects, but is sufficiently vague in others. Why? Because the Founding Fathers knew that the government would have to change as time changed, and they needed a document that would be able to go along with these changes. Think about this, right? Would you want to be controlled as the laws as they were in 1788 when the Constitution was ratified? Probably not. Most of us probably wouldn't even be in this class today. So they made certain areas sufficiently vague so the Constitution could change. They also set up a way to add amendments to the Constitution, again, making it so the Constitution could change. However, there are still parts that are definitive, meaning this is the core outline of our government. And we're seeing that being challenged today, that the current administration, I'm giving this lecture in 2025, and we're in the second term of President Trump, and we're seeing the current administration is trying to push those boundaries and trying to expand this idea of what the powers of the executive branch are. Something that is current in our climate is the president trying to say that that they do not have to abide by those in the judicial branch. Well, in our system of government, the judicial, executive, and legislative branch are all supposed to be equal. And we're seeing that, being challenged today. With this also, the scope of personal liberties has expanded over the years, but we often see conflicts emerge when personal liberties, meaning individual liberties, violate a community's accepted standards of behavior. A clear example of this is you can look at the evolution of gay marriage. We are going to see states and areas that fought against gay marriage or were in much considered more conservative areas of the countries, such as the South. Also, these areas usually had more religious hold to them. And so these areas said that this idea of same-sex marriage was against their own personal liberties. So what do we do when we have these conflicts between personal liberties? Also, we look at the scope of economic freedom. In the United States, our economic freedom supports capitalism, free markets, and the protection of private property. However, over time, the ideas of what's called laissez-faire capitalism no longer controls. In a laissez-faire capitalism, the government has actually very little power to regulate commerce or restrict the use of private property. What we see is today, federal and state governments impose many regulations, and these are often there to protect the public in areas such as health and safety, the environment, and the workplace. Think, some examples. When you go into your work, right, especially if you work at a factory, right, there are certain safety rules that have to be in place. Why? To protect you. Think about your food, right? When you go to the grocery store and you buy hamburger, right, we assume that it's safe. Why? Because of these standards that are in place. All right. Next, we're going to look at the idea of equality. What does equality mean? Equality means treating everyone equally. Again, we find this in the Declaration of Independence, where we say all men are created equal. However, did they really even mean that? Right? When we say all men, that's supposed to refer to everyone. But very clearly in our nation's history, right, at that time, that was not who it was intended to be. So when we look at this, right, what we're really meaning by equality is this idea of equality of opportunity, meaning everyone should have the same opportunities and be judged based on what they do with them. Another way of looking at this, it's this idea of the American dream, that by coming to America, by living in America, right, that you can go out there and you can work hard enough. If you just work hard enough and do your best, then anything is achievable. That's this idea of equality of opportunity. However, it often ignores past injustices, right? What about those groups who have been discriminated in the past? How do we atone for those? And these were programs such as affirmative action and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which were trying to make up for past wrongs that different groups faced. So with this, right, we're talking about ideas of equality. And I have with the little graphic here, I want to make sure you know the ideas of equality and equity are different. In equality, everyone gets the same thing. So if you look at the box on the left, the bottom left in the image, here we have 3 different people trying to watch a baseball game. And this is equality. They were all given the same box. However, we can see for the individual in the middle, it works out. It helps so they can see over the fence and watch the baseball game. However, the individual on the left, do they need that box? They don't. They would be able to see the baseball game even without the box. And then our individual on the right, they were given an equal share, yet they're still blocked. They still literally can't see the baseball game. So that's equality. Everyone is given the same thing. When we talk about equity, what we're talking about with equity is you get what you need to make everyone equal. And we see that in the image on the right. What are we trying to do? We're trying to watch the baseball game. So how do we give out the boxes? Well, the man on the left, he doesn't need one, right? He can already see the baseball game. He's not losing anything, right? The goal is to watch the game. He can still watch the game. Our person in the middle, he needs one box. He needs one box, and then he can also watch the game. And then our individual on the right, he's short enough where he needs 2 boxes. He needs 2 boxes to be able to watch the game. So in this, on the right, everyone can enjoy the game equally, yet how we get there, they have to be given things differently. The image on the left with equality, when we give everyone the same thing, that still doesn't make them, completely equal, meaning that they can't all watch the baseball game. So that's the difference between equality and equity. When we talk about political equality, what we mean by that is the right to participate in politics equally, based on the principle of one person, one vote. That means we all should have that same power, that my vote is just the same as the President of the United States. This has been better than it has in the past. Again, white men who owned a certain amount of property, those were the first people who were allowed to vote. However, it's still not for full equality in the United States. And then we talk about economic equality. Many Americans actually see this largely as the result of individual choice. Like if you don't have money, that's because of something you did. So many Americans tend to be more skeptical of government action to redress economic equality. All right, then let's move on to the last idea of justice. We talk about justice, often what we're talking about is what we call fairness. Fairness of how rewards and punishments are delivered, especially by governments and courts, but also society. What constitutes what is just or justice has been debated over time. It's closely again related to the idea of fairness, and what is just and fair should arise from the people. We also talk about ideas of social justice. What this is, it's the just allocation of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society, meaning we should all be somehow equal in that. However, we'll see as continued throughout the course is the debate of how we can do this, if we can do this, is widely contested. We see people fighting for this in today's society, but despite many Americans' reverence for justice, its meaning and practice are still often deeply contested and divided. All right, then before we get to our last section of the chapter, they have this little, what I call a side note, and it's how to, and you'll see these throughout the chapters. Please don't skip over them. But the one that we see in this chapter is an interesting one. It's on pages 24 and 25, and it's talking about how to debate respectfully. And in this, they give some ideas about best practices to engage others and to debate respectfully. Please do look at this because it does have some good ideas and practices. Because when we all go out and disagree and just yell at the top of our lungs, we really don't solve anything. What we need to do is really listen to each other and then make sure the other sides know we are trying to listen and we are hearing what they say. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but please do read those pages to look that over. All right, and then we're going to conclude the chapter with looking about what do Americans think about government. Throughout American history, Americans have been reluctant to grant government too much power. That makes sense. Why our country was founded, because literally we overthrew a government that we felt had too much power. Often Americans have also been suspicious of politicians, which personal opinion is probably a very good thing. However, what's interesting, in times of need, think about during the Great Depression, Americans often too turn to the government for assistance. And historically, Americans have strongly supported the government in times of war. However, over time, Americans' trust in government has declined. In the 1960s, 3/4 of Americans said they did trust the government. In 2021, only 24% said they did. However, that's strongly looking at federal government. When we look at local governments, this trust in local governments has stayed relatively high. And I want you to think about why this is so. Why do we tend to have more trust in our local and state governments, and we're more suspicious of the federal government? Also, the level of trust differs across groups. African American and Latinos express more confidence in the federal government than white people do. However, that would be very interesting to see a more current poll, because if this was from the 2021 poll, right, things are now different than they were then. Also, age plays a part of it. The baby boomer generation, these were individuals born between 1946 and 1964. They have more confidence in the federal government than younger generations, such as Gen Z, which is those who are born after 1996. And so why is this important? What are these implications of distrust? Well, as distrust continues, right, if we have full distrust in our government, eventually what it's going to do is render a government powerless and obsolete. Why? In a democracy such as ours, it's supposed to be a government that represents us, the people. Yet, if the majority of the population thinks the government doesn't represent them, they're probably going to look elsewhere and form some new form of government. All right, so that's going to conclude chapter 1. Again, this is an overview. It's not covering every aspect of the chapter, so do make sure you are reading the chapter in its entirety.